The Quiet Panic. So you guys have been absolutely blowing up my comments asking me to cover this story, and honestly, I've been putting it off because what I'm about to tell you is going to mess with your head in ways you're not prepared for. This isn't your typical creepy story. This is something that challenges everything you think you know about the people closest to you. It started 3 months ago when my friend Sarah called me at 2 in the morning, crying so hard I could barely understand what she was saying. Between the sobs, I managed to make out a few words that sent chills down my spine. She kept repeating the same phrase over and over again. Those eyes are no longer her eyes. Now, before I dive into what happened to Sarah and her family, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear isn't just some random paranormal encounter or a case of someone's imagination running wild. This is documented. There are witnesses, there's evidence, and by the end of this story, you're going to question everyone you think you know. I'm going to walk you through exactly what Sarah experienced, step by step, because the details matter. Every single detail matters. And I'm warning you right now, once you hear this story, you're going to start looking at people differently. You're going to start noticing things you never noticed before. Things that have probably been there all along. Sarah had been living with her grandmother for about 6 months when this all started. Her grandmother, Eleanor, was 82 years old and had been showing early signs of dementia. Nothing too severe, just the usual stuff you'd expect. Forgetting names, misplacing things, getting confused about what day it was. Sarah moved in to help take care of her, and everything seemed perfectly normal at first. Eleanor was this sweet, gentle woman who spent most of her days knitting, watching old movies and telling stories about her late husband. She had these bright blue eyes that always seemed to be smiling, even when her face was serious. Sarah always said her grandmother's eyes were the most beautiful thing about her, like looking into clear ocean water. The first sign that something was wrong happened on a Tuesday evening in late September. Sarah was making dinner when she heard her grandmother talking to someone in the living room. This wasn't unusual because Eleanor often talked to herself or sometimes had conversations with her late husband as if he were still there. But when Sarah walked into the room to check on her, Eleanor was sitting in her usual chair, staring directly at the wall. Not just looking at the wall, but staring with this intense focus that made Sarah feel uncomfortable. Eleanor's head was tilted at this weird angle, almost like she was listening to something. When Sarah called out to her, Eleanor didn't respond. She just kept staring at that same spot on the wall with this expression Sarah had never seen before. Sarah walked over and gently touched her grandmother's shoulder. And that's when Eleanor slowly turned to look at her. Sarah told me that in that moment she felt like she was looking at a complete stranger. Eleanor's eyes were the same bright blue color, but there was something different about them. Something that made Sarah take a step back. Eleanor smiled at Sarah, but it wasn't her usual warm, loving smile. It was this cold, calculated expression that didn't reach her eyes at all. She said, "Oh, hello, dear. I was just talking to the nice man in the wall." Then she turned back to stare at the wall as if nothing had happened. Sarah tried to brush it off as just another symptom of her grandmother's condition getting worse. She figured maybe Eleanor was having some kind of hallucination or episode. But that night, Sarah couldn't sleep. Something about the way her grandmother had looked at her kept replaying in her mind. Those eyes that she'd known and loved her entire life suddenly felt foreign. Over the next few days, Sarah started noticing more changes in Eleanor's behavior. Small things at first. Eleanor would stand in doorways for long periods, not moving, just blocking the entrance like she was guarding something. She stopped eating her favorite foods and would only eat things she'd never shown interest in before. She began sleeping during the day and staying awake all night, moving around the house in complete darkness. But the most disturbing change was in Eleanor's eyes. Every time Sarah looked at her grandmother, she felt like she was looking at someone wearing Eleanor's face like a mask. The expressions were all wrong. The way she moved her head was different. Even the way she blinked seemed unnatural. Sarah started keeping a journal of all the strange things that were happening, thinking maybe it would help when she talked to Eleanor's doctor. She documented every weird conversation, every unusual behavior, every moment when those familiar blue eyes seemed to belong to someone else entirely. 1 week after the wall incident, Sarah woke up at 3 a.m. to find Eleanor standing at the foot of her bed just watching her sleep. Sarah said the moonlight was streaming through the window, illuminating her grandmother's face, and what she saw made her blood run cold. Eleanor was smiling, but her eyes were completely vacant, not confused or lost like you'd expect from someone with dementia, but empty, like no one was home behind them. Sarah sat up in bed and whispered, "Grandma, what are you doing?" Eleanor tilted her head to the side, still smiling that cold smile, and said in a voice that sounded exactly like Eleanor but somehow wasn't Eleanor, "I was just making sure you were still here. Sometimes people disappear in the night, you know. Sometimes they get replaced." Then Eleanor turned and walked back to her room as if nothing had happened, leaving Sarah sitting in her bed, shaking and trying to process what she'd just experienced. The next morning, Sarah called Eleanor's doctor and explained what had been happening. The doctor suggested it might be time to consider more intensive care, maybe even a facility that specialized in dementia patients. He said the nighttime wandering and confusion were common symptoms and that sometimes patients could become fixated on strange ideas or develop paranoid thoughts. But Sarah knew this wasn't just dementia. Something fundamental had changed about her grandmother. Something that went way beyond memory loss or confusion. It was like Eleanor's personality had been completely rewritten, but her body and voice remained the same. Sarah decided to set up a small camera in the living room, just to monitor Eleanor's behavior when she wasn't around. She told herself it was for safety reasons, to make sure Eleanor wasn't falling or getting into anything dangerous. But really, she needed proof that what she was experiencing was real. The footage from that camera is what changed everything. What Sarah discovered on those recordings is something that still haunts her to this day. And when she showed me the videos, I understood why she'd been so desperate to tell someone what was happening. Because what we saw on that camera wasn't Eleanor at all. It was something else, something that had learned to perfectly mimic Eleanor's appearance and mannerisms, but had made one crucial mistake. It couldn't quite get the eyes right. Those bright blue eyes that had sparkled with warmth and love for 82 years were now cold, calculating, and watching everything with an intelligence that didn't belong to an elderly woman with dementia. They were the eyes of something that was studying Sarah, learning her routines, her habits, her vulnerabilities. And the most terrifying part? Sarah realized that whatever was wearing her grandmother's face had been there for weeks, possibly months, perfecting its performance while she'd been completely unaware that the real Eleanor was already gone. In the footage Sarah captured, Eleanor would sit in that same chair every single night, staring at the wall from 11 p.m. until exactly 4:37 a.m. Not 4:36, not 4:38, always 4:37. She never moved, never blinked, never shifted position. For over 5 hours, she would sit there like a statue and then suddenly stand up and walk to Sarah's bedroom door. But here's the part that made Sarah's stomach drop. On the camera, you could see Eleanor standing outside Sarah's door for exactly 17 minutes every night, just listening. Not moving, not trying the handle, just standing there with her head tilted toward the door like she was analyzing every sound Sarah made while sleeping. When Sarah fast-forwarded through weeks of footage, she discovered this pattern had been happening every single night since she'd moved in. The precision was inhuman. No elderly person with dementia maintains that kind of exact routine. No one does. Sarah showed me the recordings, and I swear to you, watching Eleanor on that screen was like looking at a robot that had been programmed to mimic human behavior but couldn't quite pull it off. Her movements were too deliberate, too calculated. When she walked, she placed each foot in exactly the same spots every night, like she was following invisible marks on the floor. But the eyes were what really gave it away. Even on the grainy security footage, you could see that something was fundamentally wrong with the way Eleanor looked at things. She would stare at objects for minutes at a time, studying them with this intense focus that seemed like she was memorizing every detail. Sarah decided she had to confront whatever this thing was. She waited until Eleanor was in her usual chair, staring at the wall, and walked directly into the living room. She stood right in Eleanor's line of sight and said, "I know you're not my grandmother. I don't know what you are, but you're not her." Eleanor slowly turned her head towards Sarah. And for the first time since this whole thing started, she looked genuinely surprised. Not confused like someone with dementia would be, but surprised like she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't have been doing. Then Eleanor smiled, and Sarah told me it was the most terrifying thing she'd ever seen. It was Eleanor's smile, but stretched just a little too wide, held just a little too long. Eleanor said, "Oh, sweetheart, I don't know what you mean. It's me. Your grandmother. Maybe you're the one who's not feeling well." But as Eleanor spoke, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Eleanor's voice was perfect, exactly right, but her mouth movements were slightly off. Like someone who'd learned to speak English by watching movies but had never actually had a conversation. Sarah ran to her room and called me that night, sobbing and barely coherent. She kept saying, "It's wearing her face, it's wearing her face, but those eyes are no longer her eyes." She begged me to come over, said she couldn't stay in that house alone with whatever that thing was. I drove to Sarah's place immediately, and when I got there, Eleanor was sitting in the living room knitting. She looked up when I walked in and gave me this warm, grandmotherly smile. She said, "Oh, como, hello dear, you must be one of Sarah's friends. She's been so worried about me lately, bless her heart." Ugh. For a moment, I almost believed Sarah had been imagining everything. Eleanor seemed perfectly normal, exactly like the sweet old lady Sarah had always described. But then I looked into her eyes and I felt this wave of nausea wash over me. They were Eleanor's eyes, the same bright blue color, the same shape, everything physically identical. But there was something looking back at me from behind those eyes that definitely wasn't human. It was like looking into the windows of an abandoned house where you know someone's moved in illegally. I told Sarah we needed to leave immediately. I made up some excuse about a family emergency and we got out of there as fast as we could. Sarah hasn't been back to that house since, and honestly, I don't blame her. We tried to report it to the police, but what were we supposed to say? That an elderly woman with dementia was acting strange? They suggested we contact social services and maybe look into getting Eleanor professional help. They didn't understand that the person who needed help was already gone. Sarah hired a private investigator to look into Eleanor's medical records to see if there had been any unusual incidents or unexplained disappearances in the area. What they found was a pattern that had been happening for decades. Every few years, elderly people in the county would suddenly start exhibiting strange behaviors. Their families would report personality changes, unusual sleep patterns, and most commonly that their loved one's eyes looked different. In every single case, the affected person would eventually disappear completely, leaving behind no trace except confused family members who insisted their loved one had been replaced by someone else. The investigator found newspaper clippings going back to the 1950s, all describing the same thing. Families reporting that their elderly relatives had been replaced by imposters. The stories were always buried in the back pages, dismissed as the confused ramblings of grieving families or the delusions of people who couldn't accept their loved one's mental decline. But Sarah and I know the truth now. Something has been living in that area for generations, something that feeds on elderly people and takes their place. It studies them, learns their mannerisms, their voices, their memories until it can perfectly impersonate them. But it can never quite get the eyes right. Those eyes that should sparkle with decades of love and memories instead become cold, calculating windows into something that doesn't belong in our world. Something that watches and learns and waits for the perfect moment to replace the next victim. Sarah moved across the country after this happened. She couldn't bear to stay in the same state knowing that thing was still out there wearing her grandmother's face. She still has nightmares about those empty blue eyes staring back at her. About the realization that her real grandmother had probably been gone for months before she even noticed. The house is still there. I drive by it sometimes and I can see someone moving around inside. Someone who looks exactly like Eleanor, who probably waves at the neighbors and makes small talk at the grocery store. Someone who has perfected the performance so well that no one suspects anything is wrong. But if you ever find yourself looking into the eyes of someone you love and feeling like you're staring at a stranger, trust that instinct. Because sometimes the person you think you know has already been replaced by something that learned to wear their face. And sometimes those eyes that used to be windows to their soul become windows to something else entirely, something that's been watching you back, learning everything about you, waiting for its next opportunity. Remember Sarah's story the next time someone you love starts acting just a little bit different. Because those eyes are no longer their eyes, and once you see it, you can never unsee it again.